The town of Redstone was quiet that morning. Though quiet was never really the right word for a place full of people who were always on edge. Dust swirled along the empty streets, twisting around the wooden sidewalks like ghosts that had nowhere to go. The sun had just begun to climb, casting long shadows from the tall, leaning buildings that lined Main Street. Horses shifted in their stalls, and the occasional clop of a boot echoed through the air. The townsfolk were stirring, but there was a tension that made even the simplest acts like sweeping the porch or tying a wagon feel like a careful dance. At the edge of town, past the last row of wooden stores and the blacksmith shop, there was a small cabin surrounded by a few hardy trees. Smoke rose gently from its chimney, curling into the clear sky. That cabin belonged to a woman known to everyone, though few really knew her. She was an Apache woman, strong and quiet, with eyes that seemed to see too much and too deeply. Her hair, long and dark, was always neatly braided, and she carried herself with a calm that many admired but few understood. The townspeople spoke of her in hushed tones, both out of respect and a lingering fear of the unknown. She lived by herself, tending to her small garden and her few animals. Her life was simple, yet it held a dignity that the town could never replicate. The woman had noticed something in the past few days that made her uneasy. Rumors had been spreading, whispers of a man known as the Cowboy, riding into town again. The Cowboy was infamous in Redstone. People said he was daring, unpredictable, and fearless, often pushing boundaries in ways that left the townsfolk both in awe and in fear. He had come into town many times before, sometimes to settle disputes, sometimes for reasons no one could guess. Some said he acted with honor, others said he acted with pride. One thing was certain: wherever he went, tension followed. That morning, the Apache woman was outside her cabin, tending to her small vegetable garden. She checked each plant carefully, brushing away the dust and dry leaves. The sun warmed her back, and the air smelled faintly of sage and earth. She had learned to find peace in these small tasks, even when the town around her seemed to hum with unease. But today, her peace felt fragile. She had sensed it in the air, the way the birds were unusually quiet, the way the wind moved differently. Something was coming, and she knew she had to be ready. Meanwhile, on the horizon, a lone figure appeared, moving steadily toward the town. Dust rose under the hooves of a horse, kicking up in small clouds that caught the sunlight. The townspeople began to notice the approaching rider. Some paused in their chores, their heads tilting to watch. Children stopped mid-step, staring. Even the blacksmith leaned on his hammer, wiping sweat from his brow as he observed the approach. The man was unmistakable the Cowboy. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face, a worn leather vest, and boots that had seen 1,000 miles. There was a confidence in his stride, a certainty that made people both wary and curious. As the Cowboy neared the edge of town, the Apache woman spotted him. Her heart tightened with a mix of fear and worry. She had known this day might come, but seeing him in the distance made her realize just how imminent it was. She wiped her hands on her apron, stood straight, and spoke, her voice carrying across the small clearing. "Don't. Please. Don't," she called, her words firm yet trembling with emotion. The Cowboy paused, his horse shifting uneasily beneath him. He glanced in her direction, his eyes narrowing slightly. But he didn't stop. The townsfolk watched the exchange, sensing that something important was unfolding. There was a hush in the street, a collective holding of breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause as if waiting for what would happen next. The Apache woman's voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in urgency. "I'm asking you. Don't come any closer. This isn't the way." She took a small step forward, her hands raised slightly as though to ward him off without harming him. Her heart raced, but she stood her ground. She had faced danger before, and she knew the importance of courage. She had learned that sometimes, even the strongest warning could be ignored. The Cowboy's expression didn't change much. There was a calmness to him, almost as if he had expected this reaction. He tilted his head slightly, considering her words, but then continued forward. The horse's hooves beat softly against the dry dirt, a rhythm that seemed to echo in the tense silence. Each step brought him closer to the cabin, closer to the woman who had warned him. The townspeople's whispers grew quieter, replaced by an intense silence. Windows were cracked open, and people peered out, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch. The children clutched their parents' hands, sensing the seriousness of the moment even if they did not understand it fully. The blacksmith's hammer hovered mid-air, his mind torn between curiosity and caution. Everyone in Redstone seemed frozen, caught in a moment that they would remember long after it had passed. The Apache woman took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She knew the cowboy was not a man to be easily swayed. He had a stubborn streak, a belief in his own way of doing things, and she understood that there was little she could do to change him once he had set his mind. Yet she had to try. Her warning was more than just words, it was a plea, a hope that some sense would prevail before actions were taken that could not be undone. She thought of the past, of the quiet moments she had cherished in her life, and of the community she wanted to protect. She thought of her garden, her animals, and the small cabin that represented a life built on respect and patience. And she thought of the cowboy, a man she had seen before, a man whose courage was matched only by his recklessness. She wondered what drove him, what made him so certain that he had to act, no matter the consequences. The cowboy finally stopped a few paces away, close enough that the tension between them was palpable. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. He could see the fear and the hope in her gaze, the way she was trying to communicate more than words could express. And yet, he did not retreat. The townsfolk could feel the intensity of the moment, the fragile balance between caution and action. The Apache woman took another step forward, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I know who you are," she said. "I know what you think you must do. But I beg you think again. Don't let pride or anger guide your hand. There are other ways." The cowboy's jaw tightened slightly. There was a flicker of emotion in his eyes, something that suggested he understood her, yet also felt compelled to continue. He adjusted the reins and shifted his weight in the saddle, as if preparing himself for what must come. The townspeople leaned forward slightly, unable to look away. Every muscle in the town seemed to hold tension, waiting to see whether reason or impulse would prevail. The Apache woman's gaze did not waver. She remembered the stories her elders had told her about strength and patience, about the power of words and presence. She hoped that this time, those lessons would be enough to stop what she feared might happen. Her hands, steady despite the fear, rested at her sides, ready to act if necessary but wishing desperately that she would not have to. Time seemed to stretch. Each second was heavy, each heartbeat loud in the quiet morning. The cowboy's horse shifted, sensing the tension in the air. The townsfolk whispered quietly among themselves, though the words carried no sound beyond the nearest neighbors. Children peeked from behind doors, trying to understand the gravity of the situation. And even the wind seemed to wait for the next moment. Then, the cowboy moved again, but slowly this time. There was a deliberateness to his motion, a decision that had been weighed even if it was risky. The Apache woman's eyes followed him, searching for any sign that he might change his mind. She thought of the years she had spent surviving and protecting, of the small victories and the quiet moments of peace, and she realized that this moment could change everything. The townsfolk held their breath, the silence almost unbearable. No one spoke, no one moved. Every eye was fixed on the scene unfolding at the edge of town. The horses shifted nervously, sensing the tension. The wooden buildings seemed to lean closer, as if the town itself were straining to witness what might happen. The Apache woman's voice broke the silence once more. "Please," she said, softer this time, her tone almost a whisper, yet carrying the weight of all she had seen and known. "Please don't." The cowboy paused again, and for a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of dust and sage. The world seemed suspended in a fragile balance, waiting to see whether the plea would reach him, or whether the stubbornness of one man would tip everything into chaos. And then, slowly, deliberately, the cowboy moved forward. The town remained frozen. Every eye followed him. Every heart seemed to beat in unison, sensing that something important, something unforgettable, was about to unfold. The cowboy's horse moved steadily forward, each hoofall kicking up small puffs of dust that floated in the morning sunlight. The Apache woman watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent a lifetime understanding people, reading the intentions in their eyes, and sensing the weight of their actions. Yet there was something different about the cowboy, an intensity, a determination that seemed to bend the very air around him. She knew she had to act, to make herself seen and heard. But she also understood that words might not be enough this time. The townsfolk, meanwhile, remained frozen in place, as if they had been rooted to the ground by the tension. Windows were cracked open, and faces peered out cautiously. The blacksmith rested his hand on the handle of his hammer, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Children clung to their parents, whispering questions they dared not speak aloud. Every person in Redstone seemed aware that this moment would be remembered forever, though none of them yet understood exactly why. The Apache woman took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Stop," she said, her voice firm, carrying through the quiet air. "This is not the way. You must listen." Her eyes locked with the cowboy's, and in that gaze, she poured all the warning, all the concern, and all the hope she could summon. She wanted him to understand that some actions could not be undone, that courage without care could hurt more than it helped. The cowboy slowed slightly, adjusting the reins of his horse. He looked at her, and for a brief moment, his expression softened. There was a flicker of hesitation, a trace of doubt that seemed out of place for a man known for his fearlessness. Perhaps he had expected resistance, but not the quiet strength in her eyes. Perhaps he had not counted on the weight of a warning spoken with such clarity and sincerity. Yet, even as he hesitated, he did not turn back. The townsfolk sensed the struggle in him and held their breath, waiting for what would come next. The Apache woman's voice rose a little, a mix of urgency and authority. "I am asking you," she said, stepping even closer. "Think carefully. There are better ways to settle this than the path you are choosing. I know your intentions may seem right to you, but the consequences—" She paused, her words heavy with meaning. "They will be far greater than you imagine." The cowboy tilted his head slightly, considering her words. There was a quiet tension in his jaw, a moment where thought battled impulse. He had always believed that action, bold and immediate, was often the best path. Waiting, reasoning, or listening sometimes felt like weakness to him. Yet, standing before the woman, he began to feel the weight of her plea. He sensed that this was not a confrontation of strength or pride, but one of understanding and consequence. For a brief instant, the street seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind died down, rustling only gently through the trees near the cabin. Horses shifted nervously in their stalls, and the townsfolk remained motionless, caught in the grip of anticipation. Every eye followed the interaction, every mind racing with questions. What would he do? Would he listen, or would he act? And if he acted, what would the outcome be? The Apache woman took another step forward, her hands raised slightly, not in threat, but in appeal. "You must see beyond what you want in this moment," she said. "I know courage drives you. I know pride guides your choices. But sometimes, the bravest thing is to step back. The bravest thing is to listen and to respect what others ask of you." Her voice carried a calm authority that seemed to ripple through the tense air, touching the hearts of those who heard it. The cowboy remained still, gripping the reins of his horse. He could feel the quiet power of her words, the weight of her wisdom and experience pressing against the stubbornness that had always defined him. He had faced countless challenges before, but this felt different. This was not about skill or strength, but about understanding, restraint, and the consequences of choice. His mind raced through possibilities, imagining the paths that lay ahead if he ignored her warning, and those that might open if he listened. The townsfolk began to shift slightly, sensing the subtle change in the air. Some exchanged worried glances. Others leaned forward to catch every movement. The silence of the street was almost deafening, each breath and heartbeat amplified in the stillness. Children clutched their parents' hands more tightly, feeling the tension in a way only children could, without fully understanding, yet knowing that something extraordinary was happening. The cowboy finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "I hear you," he said, though his words carried more acknowledgement than agreement. "I understand your warning. I know you fear what I might do. But I have my own reasons for being here. I cannot turn back." His eyes met hers again, searching for a sign, a hint of understanding, or perhaps permission to proceed. There was respect in his gaze, yet also a quiet determination that made it clear he would act according to his own judgment. The Apache woman felt a flicker of fear, but also a surge of resolve. She had always believed in the power of presence, in the strength of standing firm even when the odds seemed impossible. She knew that she could not force him to stop, but she could show him the weight of his choices, the impact they would have on her people, and on the town. She held her ground, her voice steady, as she spoke once more. "Then know this," she said. "Every action has a cost. Every choice leaves a mark. Whatever you do here today, it will not be forgotten, and you will have to live with what follows." The cowboy nodded slightly, a gesture that acknowledged her words without changing his course. He adjusted his posture in the saddle, preparing himself for what was to come. The townsfolk sensed the rising tension, the edge of inevitability. The moment seemed suspended, each second stretching longer than it should, each heartbeat echoing in the quiet of the morning. Then, the cowboy moved again, this time with purpose. Each step of the horse brought him closer to the cabin, closer to the woman who had warned him. The dust swirled around their feet, the sunlight glinting off the metal buckles on his belt and the worn leather of his boots. The Apache woman remained firm, her eyes never leaving his, silently communicating the weight of her plea and the depth of her concern. As he approached, the townsfolk could feel the tension in the air rise even further. Windows were opened wider, doors were cracked ajar, and people leaned out to watch. Some whispered among themselves, imagining what might happen. Others stayed completely silent, afraid that any movement could disrupt the fragile balance of the moment. Even the animals seemed to sense the tension. Horses shifting uneasily, birds fluttering briefly before settling again. The Apache woman's voice broke the silence once more, gentle yet strong. "I am not asking for you to give up," she said. "I am asking for you to see beyond yourself. I am asking for you to think of the consequences not just for you, but for all of us. There is courage in listening as well as acting, strength in restraint as well as force." Her words floated in the air, touching those who heard them, resonating in the hearts of the townsfolk who had gathered to witness the moment. The cowboy's gaze softened slightly. He felt the truth in her words, even as he felt compelled to continue. He had always believed that bold action was the measure of a person. But standing here, hearing her speak, he realized that courage could take many forms. He could act with care as well as conviction. The balance between intention and consequence had never been clearer to him than in this moment. Yet, despite the growing understanding, he did not stop. He moved forward, slowly, deliberately, each motion calculated yet imbued with the weight of his determination. The Apache woman watched him, her breath steady, but her heart racing. She knew that the moment of decision was nearly upon them, that soon the path he chose would define the day for everyone in Redstone. The townsfolk were on edge, unable to look away. The street seemed smaller, the buildings closer, the sun brighter. Every sound, the creak of a door, the rustle of leaves, the soft whinny of a horse was amplified in the stillness. It felt as if the town itself were holding its breath, aware that this was not just an encounter between two people, but a moment that would leave an impression on everyone present. Finally, the cowboy came to a stop just a few feet from the cabin. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, careful. The Apache woman remained in her position, her eyes locked on his, ready for whatever would come. The air was thick with anticipation, the quiet stretching like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. And then, the moment arrived. The cowboy extended a hand, not in threat, not in aggression, but in an action that would determine what followed. The townsfolk leaned forward, sensing the significance of the gesture. Children hid behind their parents, peeking out nervously. Adults exchanged glances, some hopeful, some fearful. Every soul in the street was caught in the gravity of the moment, knowing that the choice made here would ripple beyond this single encounter. The Apache woman looked at his hand, at the calm determination in his eyes, and felt a mixture of fear, respect, and understanding. She realized that whatever happened next, there would be consequences. But she also saw the possibility of respect, courage, and a deeper understanding between them. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long, golden beams across the town of Redstone. The dust that had swirled in the streets earlier now seemed to settle, leaving the town in a quiet tension that was heavier than any silence before. People had returned to their windows and porches after the brief pause, but their eyes never left the Apache woman and the cowboy. Something had happened, something that had changed the air itself, and everyone knew that life in Redstone would not feel the same again. The cowboy stood a short distance from the cabin, his expression calm yet thoughtful. The gesture he had made moments ago, though simple, had shifted the energy of the morning. It was not an act of confrontation, but it carried weight. The townsfolk whispered quietly among themselves, unsure how to interpret it. Some believed he had acted with respect. Others feared that it was the beginning of a chain of events no one could stop. The tension lingered like a storm cloud over the town, invisible but undeniable. The Apache woman remained where she was, standing tall and composed, her eyes still following the cowboy. Her pulse had slowed slightly since the initial shock, but her mind raced with possibilities. She knew that his actions, though measured, would have consequences. Not only would they affect the cowboy himself, but they would ripple through the community, touching people who had only been observers until now. She had seen situations like this before, where one decision, one movement, or one word could shift the balance of trust, respect, and understanding. And she understood that this moment, simple as it seemed, was one of those moments. Around the town, people began to discuss quietly among themselves, their voices low, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that hung in the air. The blacksmith, leaning on his hammer, spoke first to a neighbor. "I don't know what he was thinking," he said, shaking his head slightly, "but I think maybe he did the right thing. It wasn't what I expected, that's for sure." His neighbor nodded slowly, considering the words. They had all known the cowboy for years, and even when he surprised them, there was a sense that he acted from some inner code they could never fully understand. Children peered from behind doors and curtains, whispering questions to each other. "Why didn't he fight?" one asked. "Why didn't she stop him?" Their curiosity was innocent but pointed, showing how even the youngest in the town sensed the significance of what had just occurred. Parents exchanged glances, trying to explain in simple terms that some things in life were more about courage and respect than about action alone. The Apache woman finally stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs, calm yet commanding. "Everyone," she said, "this is a moment to pause and reflect, not to judge too quickly. Actions carry meaning, yes, but understanding carries even more. What has happened here is not about victory or defeat, it is about respect and the choices we make, even when they are hard." Her words echoed down the street, carrying a weight that silenced even the whispers of the crowd. People nodded subtly, some in agreement, some in contemplation. The cowboy watched her, feeling a mixture of relief and tension. Relief that the situation had not escalated into conflict, and tension because he understood, now more than ever, that every choice had a consequence. He had acted according to his instinct, but instinct alone was never enough. Reflection and responsibility were just as important. He had always been a man who acted first and asked questions later. But standing there, in front of the Apache woman and the watching town, He realized that there was wisdom in pausing, in listening, and in acknowledging the impact of one's actions. As the morning wore on, the townspeople began to interact more, slowly returning to their routines while keeping one eye on the unfolding situation. The blacksmith returned to his workbench, hammering carefully while glancing up now and then. The shopkeepers began to sweep their porches, pretending to ignore the tension while their minds were elsewhere. Children ran lightly through the streets, their games subdued by the awareness that something remarkable had taken place. Even the animals seemed calmer, as if sensing that the tension had shifted but not fully disappeared. The Apache woman and the cowboy remained near the cabin, talking quietly. Their conversation was low and measured, full of pauses and careful words. She explained her perspective, her experiences, and the weight of responsibility she carried not only for herself but for the community she represented. The cowboy listened, truly listened, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed someone else's wisdom to shape his thinking. His usual confidence was tempered by reflection, a realization that courage was not always in action alone. Sometimes, it was in restraint, in thoughtfulness, and in understanding the broader consequences of one's choices. By midday, word of what had happened spread further through the town. People spoke in hushed tones, describing the calm tension, the measured actions, and the quiet understanding between the two figures at the edge of town. There were no exaggerations, no unnecessary drama, just a recognition that something meaningful had taken place. Those who witnessed it would carry the memory with them for years, retelling the story to newcomers and children alike. The tale would grow not because of conflict or spectacle, but because of the quiet power of courage tempered by thoughtfulness. The cowboy eventually stepped back slightly, giving the Apache woman space. They looked at each other with mutual respect. In that silent exchange, they acknowledged the courage it took to face not just each other, but the expectations and judgments of the entire town. It was a shared understanding that words alone could not fully convey, yet it was felt deeply by both of them. The townsfolk began to disperse slowly, each returning to their homes, shops, or daily routines. But the atmosphere had changed. There was a new awareness, a recognition that courage and respect could exist together, and that one's actions were never truly isolated. They affected everyone around them. Conversations throughout the day reflected this shift. People spoke more thoughtfully, paused more carefully before acting, and considered not just what they wanted, but how their choices impacted others. Even as the town settled, the Apache woman remained near her cabin, tending to her garden and animals. She reflected on the morning, the cowboy's presence, and the delicate balance between action and consequence. She knew that life in Redstone would continue, but she also understood that the memory of this moment would remain, influencing decisions, shaping perspectives, and quietly teaching lessons long after the dust had settled. The cowboy, too, reflected as he prepared to leave the immediate area. His ride through Redstone was slower than usual, each step measured, each thought weighted with new understanding. He realized that being bold and courageous did not mean disregarding the wisdom and warnings of others. True courage, he understood now, involved balancing action with reflection, instinct with consideration, and pride with respect. As the sun began its descent, casting longer shadows across the town, a sense of calm returned to Redstone. The dust settled fully into the streets. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and earth, and the town resumed its rhythm, but not without a subtle change. The memory of the morning, the quiet confrontation, and the careful actions of the cowboy and the Apache woman lingered like a soft echo. It was a reminder of the power of patience, respect, and the importance of considering the ripple effects of every choice. By evening, the town was alive with muted conversations, laughter that returned more gently, and the ordinary routines of life. Yet in homes, shops, and on porches, people occasionally glanced toward the cabin at the edge of town, recalling the moment when the cowboy had acted with courage, and the Apache woman had responded with wisdom. They remembered the calm in the midst of tension, the pause that held the power to shape events, and the unspoken lessons that were far more enduring than any dramatic confrontation could ever be. That night, as the stars appeared in the clear western sky, the Apache woman stood outside her cabin once more. She looked at the horizon where the cowboy had come from, reflecting on the unusual and quiet courage of the morning. She felt a deep respect for his choices, even if she had not agreed with all of them, and she felt gratitude for the lesson the town had witnessed, not a lesson written in conflict, but one written in understanding, patience, and the subtle strength of thoughtful action. The cowboy rode away slowly, disappearing over the distant hills. His thoughts lingered on the morning's events, on the wisdom he had encountered, and on the quiet power of respect. He realized that actions could shape not only the immediate moment but also the hearts and minds of those who witnessed them. And in this reflection, he found a new understanding of courage, not only as daring action, but as thoughtful decision, guided by awareness and respect for others. The town of Redstone, in the days that followed, carried the story quietly but firmly in its collective memory. People spoke of it not with exaggeration, but with sincerity. They recounted the calm confrontation, the cowboy's measured actions, and the Apache woman's steadfast guidance. It became a story of balance, courage, and wisdom, a story that taught the town about the importance of pausing, reflecting, and acting with both heart and mind. In this way, life continued. But the memory of the morning lingered in small ways: a nod exchanged on the street, a thoughtful pause before action, a quiet respect between neighbors, and the lessons of that day became part of the rhythm of Redstone, shaping the town in subtle but meaningful ways, proving that courage tempered by understanding can leave a mark far greater than force alone ever could. The days that followed the morning in Redstone were quiet, but the memory of what had happened lingered in every corner of the town. Life went on. The blacksmith returned to hammering, the shopkeepers tended to their stores, children played in the streets, but there was a subtle difference in the way people moved and spoke. There was a sense that the town had witnessed something important, something that could not be forgotten. The memory of the Apache woman's warning, the cowboy's careful actions, and the pause in the middle of the street became a quiet lesson for everyone who had watched. The Apache woman continued her daily routines, tending her garden, feeding her animals, and maintaining the small cabin she called home. She walked through the town occasionally, nodding to those she knew, offering quiet words of advice to anyone who seemed to need guidance. People noticed the calm strength she carried. Her presence reminded them that courage did not always roar, it sometimes whispered through quiet, thoughtful actions, shaping the lives of those around her without force or spectacle. The cowboy, too, remained in Redstone for a few days after the incident, though he mostly kept to himself. He visited the blacksmith for tools, stopped by the general store for supplies, and occasionally spoke with townsfolk he trusted. But he also spent time thinking, reflecting on the events of that morning, and considering the lessons he had learned. He realized that bravery was more than just facing danger. It was about understanding, respect, and responsibility. He understood now that actions could ripple far beyond the moment, affecting lives and relationships in ways he had not always considered. Some townsfolk were still unsure how to feel about the cowboy. Some admired him for his courage, while others worried about the recklessness he sometimes displayed. Yet, after witnessing his measured actions with the Apache woman, many began to see a different side of him, a side capable of reflection, restraint, and respect. The balance between his boldness and his newfound thoughtfulness became a quiet example for others in the town, teaching that courage and care could coexist. The Apache woman and the cowboy met occasionally during those days, not in confrontation, but in conversation. They spoke about the town, about life, and about the choices people make. The cowboy listened carefully to her wisdom, and the Apache woman recognized that his understanding had grown. Their conversations were never loud or dramatic. Instead, they were filled with the quiet respect of two people who had confronted fear and tension, and had emerged with insight rather than conflict. One afternoon, the town gathered for the weekly market, and a sense of normalcy returned to Redstone. Stalls were set up, merchants called out their prices, and the scent of baked bread and fresh herbs filled the air. Children ran between the stalls, laughing, and neighbors exchanged friendly greetings. Yet, even in the bustling activity, there were moments of reflection. People would glance toward the edge of town, toward the cabin of the Apache woman, remembering the quiet confrontation that had changed the town. Conversations often circled back to courage, respect, and the importance of listening before acting. The Apache woman walked through the market that day, observing the life of the town with calm eyes. She smiled at children playing, offered advice to young traders, and nodded to neighbors with gentle encouragement. She felt the subtle shift in the town's energy, the way people were more careful, more thoughtful, more aware of the impact of their actions. She understood that the events of that morning had planted a seed, a quiet but powerful lesson that would grow over time. The cowboy lingered near the edge of the market, watching the activity with a sense of reflection. He realized that his role in Redstone had changed, that his presence was now connected to responsibility as much as to action. He understood that respect and courage were intertwined, and that the quiet wisdom of others could guide even the boldest hearts. He found himself thinking not just about his own choices, but about the effects those choices had on the people around him. As the days turned into weeks, the memory of the confrontation became part of the town's story. People spoke of it quietly, in respectful tones, sharing the tale with newcomers and children. They recounted how the Apache woman had stood firm, how the cowboy had acted with intention, and how the town had paused to witness a moment that was both simple and profound. It was a story not of conflict or drama, but of understanding, reflection, and the power of thoughtful action. The Apache woman continued to be a figure of guidance in Redstone. People came to her for advice, not because she demanded attention, but because they recognized the strength of her calm, measured approach to life. She taught lessons through her actions as much as through her words, showing that courage, respect, and understanding could shape a community in ways far greater than force ever could. The cowboy, too, carried the lessons of that morning with him. His interactions with the townsfolk became more considerate, his decisions more deliberate, and his courage tempered with thoughtfulness. He discovered that leadership and strength were not just about bold actions, but also about listening, learning, and respecting the perspectives of others. His relationship with the Apache woman grew into one of mutual respect, each recognizing the strength and wisdom in the other. Life in Redstone continued, with its usual routines and occasional challenges. But the story of that morning, the moment when the town had frozen in anticipation, when the Apache woman had spoken her warning, and when the cowboy had acted with measured intention, remained a touchstone for the community. It reminded people that courage and respect were not mutually exclusive, that actions carried consequences, and that the quiet choices we make can leave lasting impressions on those around us. In the evenings, as the sun set over the dusty streets and painted the wooden buildings in shades of gold and orange, the Apache woman would sometimes stand at the edge of her cabin and look toward the horizon. She reflected on the events of that day and the lessons they had brought. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the town had witnessed a moment of integrity, restraint, and understanding. She knew that life would continue, with its challenges and uncertainties, but she trusted that the lessons of that morning would continue to guide the people of Redstone. The cowboy, meanwhile, would often ride slowly through the outskirts of town, considering his choices and reflecting on the paths he had taken. He felt a deep sense of connection to the town, to the Apache woman, and to the understanding they had shared. He realized that true courage was not just in bold action, but in the wisdom to act with consideration, to respect others, and to understand the consequences of one's decisions. Over time, the town of Redstone became known not just for its dusty streets and wooden buildings, but also for the quiet lesson it had witnessed. Travelers passing through would hear the story of the Apache woman and the cowboy, and they would be reminded of the power of patience, reflection, and respect. It became a story told not with exaggeration or drama, but with sincerity and a deep appreciation for the subtle strength of thoughtful action. The Apache woman and the cowboy never became the center of attention in the town. They did not seek praise or recognition. Instead, they became symbols of quiet courage and understanding, living their lives with integrity and respect. Their actions, though simple, had left an indelible mark on the community, shaping the way people thought, acted, and treated one another. As the seasons changed, the town continued to thrive. Gardens grew, horses roamed the streets, children laughed and learned, and neighbors supported one another. But beneath the surface of everyday life, the memory of that morning remained a quiet reminder that courage tempered with thoughtfulness could guide even the most uncertain moments. The townsfolk remembered that courage could be patient, respect could be steadfast, and understanding could shape a community in ways that force never could. Years later, people would still speak of that morning at the edge of town, when the cowboy approached the Apache woman's cabin, when the town held its breath, and when thoughtful action and reflection triumphed over rash decisions. It became more than a story, it became a lesson. A quiet truth that shaped the values of Redstone for generations. People learned to pause, to consider the consequences of their actions, and to respect the wisdom of others. They learned that true courage is measured not only by what we do, but also by how we listen, understand, and act with care. And so, life in Redstone continued, ever influenced by that one morning of tension, reflection, and quiet courage. The Apache woman remained a figure of wisdom and calm, the cowboy a man of measured bravery, and the town itself a place where lessons learned through thoughtfulness and respect became part of the rhythm of everyday life. The events of that day became a symbol of the power of integrity, understanding, and the subtle strength that comes from balancing action with reflection. In the end, the story of Redstone, the Apache woman, and the cowboy was not about conflict or spectacle. It was about people, how they faced fear, how they made choices, and how they lived with the consequences. It was about the quiet moments that hold more meaning than the loudest actions. It was about courage, respect, and the lessons that endure long after the dust has settled and the town has returned to its routines. And so, the town, the Apache woman, and the cowboy lived on, carrying the lessons of that morning with them, shaping the present and guiding the future. Every glance, every decision, and every interaction was subtly influenced by the memory of a moment when patience met courage and respect guided action. Redstone was forever changed, not by force, but by understanding, thoughtfulness, and the quiet power of human wisdom.